Now in this lecture we are going to talk about graph types. So generally graph can be categorized into two categories. So in the first category it is directed graph, and in the second category it is undirected graph. Now if we go one step further, directed graphs can be weighted graphs and unweighted graphs, and also undirected graphs also can be weighted graphs or unweighted graphs. Now here we don't have any subcategory for unweighted graphs, but in case of weighted graph, the graphs can be positive graph and negative graphs. In case of undirected graph, also weighted graphs can be positive and negative graph. Now let's look at all categories one by one to see the differences between them. Now the first category is unweighted undirected graph. Now in this case, this graph over here is unweighted and undirected graph because there is no any weight that is associated with the edge over here, and there is no special direction over here. So this means that from V1 we can go to V2, and from V2 we can come back to V1. For example, from V4 we can go to V5, and from V5 we can come back to V4. So in this case there is no any specified direction. So that's why this is undirected, and there is no any weight that is associated with this graph over here. That's why it is unweighted graph. So let's continue to the next category. So the next category is unweighted directed graph. So in this case you can easily see that in this graph over here there is direction in each edge over here, but there is no any weight that is associated with these edges over here. So that's why in this case it is unweighted, because there is no weight that is associated with this edge over here, and this is directed because you can easily see that from V1 I can go to V2, but from V2 I cannot come back directly to V1, because in this case from V1 to V2 we have only one direction. So this arrow over here, it shows that it is only one direction way from V1 to V2. Now similarly, from V2 to V4 we have only one direction. From V3 to V5 we have only one direction. So if we have any direction that is associated with any edge over here, in this case it's called directed. And if we don't have any weight that is associated with this edge over here, in this case it's called unweighted graph. So if we combine them, we are getting unweighted directed graph. Now let's continue to the next type. So the next type is positive weighted undirected graph. Now in this case we are going to look at them one by one. So in this case the positive means that the weights that are associated with this edge over here are positive. So in this case we don't have any negative number. So in this case that's why this graph called positive, and we can easily see that we have weights that are associated with this edge. So this means that this is weighted graph, and we don't have any direction in this case. So this means that we can go any direction between these vertices over here. So that's why it's called undirected graph. So if we don't have any specific direction between the nodes, so this means that this is undirected graph, and weights are positive, and we have weights that are associated with this edge over here. So that's why it's called positive weighted undirected graph. Now the fourth category is positive weighted directed graph. Now in this case it's obvious that the weights that are associated with the edge over here are positive, so we don't have any negative number. So you can easily see that all numbers over here are positive, and we have numbers that are associated with the edge, so that's why it's called weighted. But in this case we have specific directions. So here again we can go from V1 to V2, we cannot come back from V2 to V1 directly. But it's possible to come from V2 to V1 by using other directions, but in this case we cannot use the same road that comes from V1 to V2. So that's why in this case it's called directed graph. So we can call it positive weighted directed graph because of these specifications over here. Now the next category is negative weighted undirected graph. So if any weight that are associated with the edge over here is minus, in this case we are calling this graph negative weighted graph. So this is negative weighted graph because we have two minus edge over here, so we should have at least one minus edge. So in this case we have two edges, so if we have at least one negative number, we can call it negative weighted graph. So in this case you can easily see that we don't have any direction, so this means that this is undirected graph. So that's why our graph over here is called negative weighted undirected graph. Now let's continue to the next type of the graph. So the next type is negative weighted directed graph. So it's obvious that here again we should have at least one negative number, so you can easily see that we have from v1 to v3 we have minus 3 over here, and from v1 to v4 we have minus 5. So this means that we have two negative numbers that are associated with the edge. So in this case, this is negative graph, so it's obvious that we have weights over here, so that's why it's called weighted graph, and it's directed graph, because in this case you can easily see that these arrows over here shows the direction, so that's why this is directed graph. Now with this, we have come to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture we have discussed 6 different types of graph, and we have shown them one by one with examples. So hopefully everything is clear about graph types. So see you in the next lecture.